So I just wanted to say welcome, everybody. My name is Hannah Scott. We're looking forward to the conversation today. I'm the program director. I'm trying to get you a chat message here at the same time. So I'm the program director for the Center for Cooperatives in the College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State University. And we're really excited about this conversation today in conjunction with great partners across the region. And we want to make this very conversational. So we invite you to participate yourselves in the conversation. If you're comfortable joining with video, we encourage that, but we also want to let you know that we are recording. So however you're comfortable. Ask questions, please. Share your experiences. Let us know if you've had similar experiences to the things we're going to talk about, or if you want to share resources. You can chat us in the Zoom toolbar, and we're going to share some resources, events, articles, hopefully things to keep that conversation going in the chat as well. We will make this session available online after today. Please give us a little bit of time in order to get that session, that recording posted. We'll send an email to registered participants afterwards, letting you know that the recording is available, but it does take us a little bit of time to make sure that we get that processed appropriately. And then at the end of the session today, you'll be redirected when you close out of Zoom to an evaluation. We really appreciate feedback. It helps us improve future Appalachia Cooperates Initiative opportunities. We take those responses seriously. And then also keep in mind that sharing information about yourself through those evaluations is completely voluntary. So just a little bit about the Appalachia Cooperates Initiative. I think there's many familiar faces here on the call, but some new ones. Really, the ACI is a learning network that's really focused on connecting cooperative, community, business, and economic developers in Central Appalachia. Really, the goal is to contribute to a thriving ecosystem for cooperatives and cooperative-like businesses in the region. We want to build awareness of the model. We want to equip practitioners with skills and knowledge, and we want to facilitate a connected network. And actually, we're going to talk more in a little bit about why we think that's important, or at least I'll speak to that from my own perspective, why we think that's important. And I just want to recognize that this was built out of a conversation with some of the folks here on the call years ago, thinking about how to build this ecosystem in Appalachia. And so it really has been a collaborative dialogue, and we couldn't have done it without partners for sure. So thank you to those partners, folks that are rejoining. Before we get started, here's a little bit more about our center. If you're not familiar with us, we assist entrepreneurs, educate the community, and generate knowledge about cooperatives, which of course are mutually owned, democratically controlled businesses, and why we're here today. I'd encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter if you don't already receive it. We encourage you to get on that newsletter so you can see what else we're doing and get involved in other conversations. And then we'll share feedback after the session. But I wanted to invite you, each of you, to share a little bit about yourself through a poll that my colleague Sam is going to launch that really just helps us understand who's on the call today so that we can have a conversation. So just thinking about the role that best describes your connection to the co-op community and really what you're interested in learning about. So folks are participating. Awesome. Thank you so much. And Sam, we'll keep looking at that. Really looks like folks are in the education and extension space, or working with government agencies, or a couple of folks thinking about cooperatives as a member or leader or even employee, or thinking about cooperatives through an economic development lens, which we're really excited to think about today. So our topic this afternoon is cooperatives and sustainable development in Appalachia, and we're so excited to have amazing panelists with us. And I'm going to stop talking so we can get to those amazing panelists, and I'm going to ask our moderator, Dr. Catherine Engel, with the University of Kentucky's Appalachian Center to kick it off. Thanks, Catherine.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. Thank you all for putting this together, all the folks at Ohio State and the great center that y'all continue to lead these conversations in the region. So thanks for bringing everybody together. I just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of give a little background and context to today's panel. This group that we have today gave a really wonderful presentation at the Appalachian Studies Association conference back in March. And that was part of a series about flooding and just transition in Appalachia. And so in terms of sustainable development, post-coal development, and just transitions, cooperative models, worker self-directed enterprises, and non-capitalist economic formations, I think really present opportunities for communities throughout the region to build power and self-sufficiency, and also shift the discourse about what economic development means and for whom. And so although, cooperatives have been around for a long time in the region's communities, and organizations are continuing to experiment with different business models, different decision-making processes, and different associations working together to create new structures. And so we'll hear some about that today. And so given the challenges in the region and beyond, relating to things like climate change, inequality, supply chains, I think cooperative models present different ways of tackling these problems relating to power, local production, and sustainability. So today's panelists will explore a number of those topics, including potential relationships between cooperatives and sustainable development goals, current efforts to support a cooperative ecosystem in Central Appalachia, and also opportunities and barriers to cooperatives in the region. So I want to let us get to the meat of the presentations here, but I will give introductions, and then we'll let everybody talk for 10 or 12 minutes, and then we'll come back together at the end for a Q&A session. So if you have questions that come up, please do put that in the chat. We'll monitor those, and then we can circle back. So first, to introduce our panelists, Todd Nesbitt. He's a professor of geography at Lock Haven University in Pennsylvania. His research interests span a diverse range of topics, including political ecology of resource use in Appalachia, Scots Irish and Ulster Scots identity and cooperative economics. And he has developed and coordinated a study abroad program examining ethnic conflict and a path towards peace in Northern Ireland. His most recent work focuses on building a cooperative-based economy in Appalachia and how cooperatives facilitate sustainable development. So maybe we'll let Todd kick us off, and then I'll introduce our next, or actually I'll go ahead and introduce all our panelists here at the beginning. Hannah Scott, JD, is the program director, as she's already introduced herself, at the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences Center for Cooperatives, housed at the Ohio State University South Centers. She leads the creation and implementation of programs and assistance to foster cooperative and rural businesses in Ohio, West Virginia, and beyond. Hannah is passionate about cooperative opportunities in agriculture and rural communities, having worked with a variety of agricultural producers to establish co-op enterprises, and leading the Ohio and West Virginia Food Hub Network and the Appalachia Cooperatives Initiative. And then lastly, we have Myrisa Christy. She began working with K-Card in 2012 and is currently the project and development specialist. Myrisa leads K-Card's work in Eastern Kentucky and with Appalachian partners. She helps farmers and cooperatives with starting businesses, business planning, and finding funding resources for the food systems in Kentucky. So thank you all for being here, and we'll turn it over to Todd.
Okay, super. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to fellow panelists for joining me in discussing this topic today. I think it's safe to say that we all believe that cooperatives are critical for achieving the sustainable regional economic development within Appalachia. And perhaps I could even say that we, as a group, envision an Appalachian regional development policy that is based on the 7 cooperative principles. And those, I'm sure those principles will come up later in our chat today. So the connection between co-ops and sustainable development is gaining considerable momentum. The UN's Day of Cooperatives theme for this year is Cooperatives for Sustainable Development. So it's very fitting that we are discussing this within the Appalachian context. My role here is to outline the broader context of underdevelopment within Central Appalachia and talk about how cooperatives can help achieve equitable and sustainable development within the region. And after that, Hannah and Myrisa will provide us with information about worker co-ops and how we are working to build a cooperative ecosystem within Central Appalachia through the Appalachia Cooperatives Initiative. The current form of capitalism has failed the majority of Central Appalachians. Allow me to use my home state of West Virginia to demonstrate this point. More than half of West Virginia's children are low income or poor. West Virginia ranks 49th in median household income, with 18% of its population living in poverty. The state reports the lowest bachelor's degree attainment in the country at 19.6%. The average life expectancy for a man in McDowell County, West Virginia, is 67 years, and this is equal to the African countries of Burundi and Sudan. In West Virginia, nearly 15% of the population struggles with food insecurity and hunger. West Virginia ranks 50th in the number of job opportunities that provide a living wage. More than 40% of West Virginia's rivers are too polluted to pass simple water quality safety standards. Clearly, the current economic model is badly broken. And as author Chris Hedges suggests in his book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, West Virginia has become a sacrifice zone of human and environmental devastation. Appalachian scholars have for decades addressed the exploitation and underdevelopment of Appalachia. The region's poverty has been attributed to environmental determinism, a degenerate culture, and predatory colonial capitalism. And while these models have made for some pretty interesting academic debate, they have really done little to alleviate the plight of the impoverished. Today, there is general agreement among Appalachian scholars that the extractive-based development models applied to the region have grossly failed. We are asking questions like the following. Why should we continue to embrace a development model that is systematically impoverished Central Appalachia? Are there alternative models available to help us transition from decades of economic underdevelopment to a future of sustainable prosperity? It's time for us to broaden the development discussion to include issues of human well-being and environmental community and economic sustainability. Let me pose to you the following questions. How do we change the narrative surrounding economic development policy within Appalachia? How do we build a regional economy grounded in broad-based capitalism? How do we, that is a form of capitalism that is inclusive and builds regional wealth within Appalachia for the majority of its people. The way that we do this, I believe, is through the democratization of the Appalachian economy. And we can do this through building a regional ecosystem of interdependent cooperatives. Co-ops make up 12% of the total global employed population, and they're examples of successful cooperative regional economies around the world. Two of note are the cooperative-based regional economies of Mondragon, Spain, and the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, both of which were some of the poorest regions in Western Europe 80 years ago. Emilia-Romagna, a region of nearly 4.5 million people, has one of the densest co-op economies in the world. 2 out of every 3 inhabitants are co-op members, and together they produce around 30% of the region's GDP. In the Basque region of northern Spain, Mondragon, that is, 260 cooperatives employ nearly 80,000 people. Today, Mondragon and Emilia-Romagna have the strongest, most sustainable, and resilient regional economies in all of Europe. And it's because of co-ops. A 2012 publication reads, "The Mondragon Model, how a Basque cooperative defied Spain's economic crisis. So why is this the case? Cooperatives are hybrid organizations that maximize value instead of profit. They are owned, governed, and controlled by their members. They are more resilient than conventional enterprises in times of crisis, thanks to their unique governance characteristics that ensure member centrality. Studies show that co-ops are more resilient and responsive to community needs in times of crisis. That includes economic crisis, crisis associated with natural disasters, think flooding in Appalachia, and health-related crises, think, for example, the opioid epidemic within West Virginia. Appalachians champion freedom and democracy. So why should we be deprived of economic democracy? Why should we continue to support the corporate plutocracy of predatory, undemocratic forms of capitalism at our own expense? Why can't we have an economic model within Central Appalachia that is inclusive, democratic, resilient, sustainable, and one that builds broad-based community wealth? I contend that co-ops give us the best chance of building economic democracy and long-term sustainable development within Central Appalachia. So why are co-ops appropriate organizational vehicles for sustainable development? Let's first define sustainable development. Very simply, it's development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The concept first emerged in the late 1980s because of scientists recognizing human impact on climate change and a reduction in ecosystem function due to species decline and environmental degradation. In short, sustainable development is growth that must be accomplished with respect for nature and humankind. Sustainable development aims to change the narrative, to help us think more broadly about what development means and how to create an economic model that is beneficial to all and protects the environment. And we all know that Appalachia needs to be part of this discussion. We can think of sustainable development as a three-legged stool comprised of the following: 1, environmental sustainability; 2, social responsibility; and 3, economic justice. If any one of those legs is weak, then our stool becomes unstable. It just so happens that all cooperatives follow a set of 7 principles that integrate environmental, social, and economic objectives. Because of this, most cooperative enterprises achieve sustainable development by default. Sustainable development is embedded into the DNA of co-ops. So let's consider the following 8 reasons as to why we need co-ops to achieve sustainable development within Appalachia. 1, co-ops are practical vehicles for cooperation and collective action, both of which are crucial to sustainable development. They build and reinforce community, which is both a medium for and a measure of sustainable development. 2, given community ties and less need for short-term profits, co-ops have the capacity to embrace and act on longer planning horizons. 3, co-ops help stabilize regional economies and provide a favorable climate for further investment. 4, co-ops reduce inequality and promote equitable sharing of the costs and benefits of sustainable development. 5, co-ops promote economic democracy and the empowerment of marginalized groups, a hallmark of sustainable development and a precondition for shared responsibility and environmental sustainability. 6, co-ops serve as facilitating partners and alliances involving local and national and public and private sector organizations. 7, sustainable development is knowledge and management intensive. Co-ops have the organizational capacity for communication, training, and education that is required for sustainable development. Last but not least, number 8, Co-ops are part of a world movement that has strong links to other contemporary social movements focused on the environment, women's liberation, democracy, development alternatives, poverty, and resisting neoliberal globalism. So I'll now pass it on to Hannah and Myrisa to give us details about how we are operationalizing this approach at the ground level.
Thanks so much, Todd. I am going to switch to share some slides just so that you guys can see some other visuals instead of just me while we're talking here. But thank you so much, Todd, for setting the stage and thinking about the context for cooperative development and sustainable development goals more broadly. Can everybody see my screen? It's got some nice colorful pictures on it. Cool. Thank you. I appreciate the live feedback there, even though we're on a virtual platform. So first, I just want to start out just contextualizing cooperatives in Appalachia before we start thinking about how do you grow an ecosystem of cooperatives? What are the drivers of cooperative development? And I want to say first that personally, I was born and raised in the Appalachian region of Ohio. And I've returned to live in the community where I was raised. So I come to this work from a personal place, and also because of my academic training. I have degrees in sociology and rural sociology. I'm so excited that Catherine's here today as a fellow rural sociologist. And I also have a law degree and a law license here in Ohio. So I'm really interested in entrepreneurship and business ownership and cooperative governance, particularly from a legal perspective. So if anybody's interested in those spaces too, feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about co-ops. But I just want to share, first of all, a little bit of context for the cooperative ecosystem that does exist in Central Appalachia, including factors that support co-op growth. Because I want to recognize first that Appalachia is not a monolith, right? This work is not a panacea. We're focused on what we call Central Appalachia. If you're familiar with the Appalachian Regional Commission, which I'm sure many of you are, these are parts of what's called North Central Appalachia, according to the ARC. So portions of Southeast Ohio, Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Southwest Pennsylvania. But we want to recognize that's a big place, right? And that's not even all of Appalachia. This region is diverse. We have diverse communities, and we have diverse community members who have lived experiences that differ in ways that are big and small. And Appalachia's cooperative economy reflects that. So there are co-ops in the region that are doing amazing work. They're doing the work that I like to think about co-ops as problem-solving vehicles, right? Co-ops see a problem and they work towards solving that problem in a way that's rooted in their communities. So there are worker-owned co-ops existing in this region doing great work. So shout out to like Athens Casa Nueva, which is a restaurant and cantina. And I can't verify this, I have not verified this, but I think it's the oldest continuously operated worker co-op in Ohio, at least that I'm aware of. That picture on your top left is Unity Cafe, which is a worker-owned coffee and tea house in Parkersburg, West Virginia. There are, of course, really important co-ops doing things like providing vital services like electricity and telecommunications and broadband in places like Southeast Ohio. So the Southeast Ohio Broadband Cooperative is working here in Washington County, Ohio. We have a number of rural electric cooperatives throughout the state of Ohio, one just right here in our backyard. There are ag co-ops too that are doing really important work of supporting the region's farmers and food system. Todd talked about that food system when he contextualized the region, right? So there are farmers doing things like marketing beef for their members. There are groups that are helping farmers reach established marketplaces or to distribute their products more effectively. All of that around supporting livelihoods for farmers and access to food for community members. Many of you are probably aware that consumer co-ops include credit unions that provide really vital banking services to communities often that are underserved. There's a credit union right across the street from my office where I am today that has over 30 locations in Southern Ohio. So I really just want to recognize that this region has a diversity of cooperatives that are out there working and have been for decades, and that the region also has a long history of cooperatives and a cooperative economy. Some of that has been tied to labor activism and intertwined with labor activism in the cooperative community, which is not uncommon, across the country, right? We see those places intertwined throughout history. But with all that said, one of the things we want to point out is that we think there's more opportunity for cooperatives in the region. So based on a co-op census, this is a map that you guys are seeing that our team completed a census of cooperatives in 2020 and 2021, which is a little harder than you want to think, honestly, but it's about to get easier. Those of us who are co-op nerds are excited about a co-op question being included in some US Census Bureau reports, questions included in those surveys. Anyway, this is something that our team did in 2020 and 2021 to identify the co-ops in the state of Ohio. And it shows cooperative locations, so physical locations where co-ops are headquartered. It's based on publicly available data from multiple industry organizations and federal and state agencies. So we estimated based on this work that there are about 450 cooperatives headquartered in the state of Ohio. That bright green line that you see actually delineates the Appalachian region of Ohio. So Appalachia to the east of that line, non-Appalachia to the west of that line. And you can see that there are fewer co-ops in the Appalachian region. Likely that's due partly to lower population, of course, right? And we need more research to definitively quantify what that regional variation is, and then to understand causal factors that contribute to that. So this is my call to scholars out there to say, like, there's a ton of space to study these things. So let us know if you'd like to get involved in that. But there are other co-op thinkers who have identified what they argue are factors that support co-op growth within regions and within communities. The rural sociologist in me thinks we need to explore how those factors apply in rural contexts, because this work in particular that I'm highlighting here on the slide was done in an urban context, and particularly for worker cooperatives and ecosystems of worker cooperatives. And as Todd pointed out, and I just pointed out, there's a ton of diversity in this model, right? There's a ton of variability in the way that the cooperative approach is applied. But I think that this ecosystem framework is really useful for thinking about, well, what are the contexts that support cooperative development? And then what do we need to do to build that ecosystem around us? So you can see on the left of the screen, these thinkers identified what they call essential elements that must be in place, really, in order for a cooperative ecosystem to develop and then thrive. And then you see important elements and then good elements, but maybe they're not foundational as you move to the right of this framework, right? So things like skills and capacity, technical assistance, financing, the folks who can help provide those things. I'm not sure that any of us who work in cooperative development are necessarily surprised by these things. If you are, let's chat about that. I'd love to hear that. But I think that thinking of this in a framework approach is quite helpful. I also want to point out that there are other scholars who have been thinking about what drives cooperative development. I teach an undergraduate class on agricultural cooperatives, and these are drivers of cooperative development historically that I think about with those undergraduate students. So things like market failures. The economists on the Zoom, I know there's some, right? We're thinking about traditional market failures like monopoly power and missing markets. Economic crises have traditionally driven cooperative development, right? Depressions and recessions have been reasons for people to explore self-help. New technology, you can see this now in broadband, for example. The growth in broadband deployment among the rural electric cooperative community is expected to be quite high over the next 5 to 10 years, for example. There have been advocates traditionally for cooperatives, for example, just pointing out a couple here, traditional in the ag sector, the National Farmers Union and the American Farm Bureau have supported cooperative development throughout their history. And then public policy, there have been legislative initiatives and programs from public agencies that have been extremely vital for developing cooperatives. So Todd actually highlighted some examples of networks of co-ops that are arguably building sustainable development and resilience into their system by the fact that they're connected, at least in part, right? That they're highly networked. I also like to point out that we have an example of this, I think, here in the United States in the rural electric co-op system. I think that this is a real example of a resilient co-op network that has benefited from those historic drivers of co-op development, for example, from market failure, leaving large parts of the country without electricity, to public policy that has really supported the growth of, for example, the rural utility service and electric cooperatives. But the US electric cooperatives are actually also really highly networked. The average size of an electric co-op here in the state of Ohio is about 11,000 customers. That's not all that big. So I think part of the way, I would argue part of the way that they stay sustainable as business enterprises who provide this important service is through that networking. So there's a national association. The National Rural Electric Co-op Association has over 900 rural electric co-ops. They serve 56% of the US landmass. And that national organization provides, for example, oversight of employee benefit programs. They provide director trainings, they provide communications, they do these really important background service type work. These electric cooperatives also have a really strong history of working together cooperatively when there's something they need that they're not finding in the marketplace. So for example, electric cooperatives have started their own insurance cooperative, right, to offer property and casualty insurance, D&O insurance, cyber insurance, workers' comp, and then training around preventing accidents, for example. These co-ops have worked together to do group purchasing more efficiently. So, you know, all of these electric co-ops need things like hardware and transformers and meters. Why not do that in a collective approach to create some savings? They've formed data processing cooperatives. They formed a finance corporation in the 1960s, the late 1960s. All of these examples of ways that cooperatives are networking with each other to create that resilient network. So I just want to point out that part of what we're doing here with the Appalachia Cooperates Initiative is intended to help build that network, right? It's intended to help build that skill and capacity and technical assistance that is that foundation. So we have been doing things like hosting community workshops, hosting documentary film screenings, doing educational webinars like this, all in order to connect that community and to build awareness, right? So thinking about things like the nuts and bolts of co-ops, thinking about how other regions are working with the cooperative model and supporting cooperative development, thinking about how we can connect people to one another in order to identify shared opportunities. So all of that is to say that we think that this is a community-based approach, a collaborative approach, and that's part of what we're trying to do with the ACI. We'd really like to continue building that by engaging more broadly with influencers and gatekeepers around community and economic development, and providing more opportunities to build technical skills. But we can talk more about that. I'd love to hear what others on the call think about that. I'm just going to put a plug in that we record these sessions, as I mentioned up at the top, and we put them online at this link. In particular, we had a session with Ohio's electric cooperatives, where one of our colleagues talked about that resilient network that electric co-ops build. And I would encourage you to take a look there to learn way more than I could talk about. He's a very knowledgeable person. So with that, I'm gonna stop and hand it to my colleague, Myrisa Christy, to think more about opportunities and challenges, and then hopefully open it up to a larger conversation with you all. Thanks for your time.
All right, thank you, Hannah and Todd. I'm always impressed with your all's knowledge and the level of scholarship that you bring to cooperative work. So let me bring us all down a moment to my level. But so let me, all right, there we go. So what I'm looking at is, some of the cooperative responses, some barriers in co-ops. And first, can everybody see a screen with a slide on it? Are we good? Okay, great. Should always check. But and some of the things that have stood in for co-ops or ways that it's almost a co-op. So looking at some of those. So when we think about that, one of the things that, when I first got asked is like, we know you guys did this program with co-op. So when the tornadoes came through the west central and western part of Kentucky in December of 2021, we were able to work with a funder and then local cooperatives like feed stores and farm supply stores that were structured as cooperatives to be able to get supplies directly to farmers in the affected counties. So at this point, right at $1 million. I think the final receipts have come in and it is over $1 million. I know it sounds crazy that we're just now getting the final receipts, but we ran the program all of 2022 and we're making sure that everything's right. So the reason that we chose co-ops to work with and eventually independently owned farm stores was that they're nimble. They're able to respond to the community need. They're serving their members here, not just a customer. A lot of times, if you like some southern states, for example, are co-ops and some are not locally owned co-ops. So, we found that they were able to work very quickly to identify farmers that they knew had it. And the way the program was actually set up was that a farmer would come in and just get supplies and for a certain amount of money and then sign up that, yeah, I was impacted by a tornado or a wind damage. So there was no like, you have an application, none of that, come get your stuff. So, and interestingly, since we've gone over the receipts, we only had 2 times that people tried to defraud the system by going to different farm stores. So that was kind of heartening when you're giving out $1 million, and we actually, the co-op stores were able to accept the money up front. Like we would give them 30,000 in a go and say, get rid of that. And they would come back to us and say, give us more. And it worked really, really well. And I think a lot of it though, is because if you're dealing with a larger corporation whose interests are in serving their distant share stockholders or an individual owner, you're rather than serving your user members, there's a difference between what interest you're serving, right? One of the key things with a co-op, and I've listened, but you all said very many intelligent things, so I can't remember, but one of the key things is co-ops aren't just to make money. That's not the only responsibility a board of a co-op has. It does have the responsibility to keep the co-op in business, but it also has the responsibility to serve the best interest of its members. And so that's one of the reasons I think that co-ops in general, in this case, were so much easier to work with. And we just didn't have, unfortunately, during the floods in Eastern Kentucky in 2022, we didn't have as many locally owned co-ops to work with, and there were already other mechanisms in place. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. So some of the things that, when I think of cooperative barriers, because I've been on calls and projects with a few on this call and some others, making an idea, a lot of times when people want to start a co-op, when they come to us, they want to start a co-op for something that is not a profitable business idea on its own, and like somehow making it a co-op is going to make it magically profitable, which isn't the case. Although you can work on, just like any business, work on ways to help improve the profitability. And we were talking specifically about worker co-ops because that's what I think about a lot in Eastern Kentucky as we continue to lose grocery stores and everything from grocery stores, hardware stores, you name a small business and we're losing it, is a lot of times they don't have a succession plan for those businesses. And so we've looked at, like, can a worker co-op model work where the employees actually become the owners as the cooperative. And the issues we face there is it is an unfamiliar model. The employee actually assumes a lot more risk as a worker owner than they do as an employee. So because then they become responsible for the like if they're, especially if they're serving on the board, the management side of that business. And we're talking about a small grocery store, you're not talking about a ton of employees here. So some of them are going to serve on the board, up to a quarter of them or maybe more. And it just really requires a different level of commitment. The other issue that we've seen, I've worked with some people that have tried to start, for example, if a manufactured housing park in Eastern Kentucky, and they wanted to, the owner that was renting the lots that their manufactured housing set on was ready to sell it. And, usually real estate transactions just go to the next person who wants to make money off of manufactured housing parks. An intermediary, a nonprofit, actually a community development financial institution, purchased it and then wanted to turn it over, like make a co-op out of it. One of the issues they had was when they were trying to, the population of the people who lived in the housing did not believe that someone was really doing this for their best interest, because historically that's been rare for them. They didn't have the capital to buy in. And you're looking at loan instruments to try to get a loan for them to, purchase their own facilities. Or we've seen housing and apartment complexes looked at the same way. A lot of these are going to require really large capital investment from the co-op member initially, or a personal guarantee on a loan, which is a huge issue, especially if you have a co-op that's going to serve people that they don't have a lot of wealth. So whether you're thinking about a farmer co-op or a manufactured home co-op or a grocery store cooperative, worker owner grocery store, all of those things involve at some point someone signing a dotted line to say, I'm responsible for this debt, or having the capital to put into it. So not to overemphasize the money aspect of a barrier, but it's considerable. So the other thing is myself included, we put our hopes and dreams in these co-ops. We want fair wages for workers, like above normal, which then means that, which means that if you're opening a grocery store co-op, right? So you want fair wages for workers. So prices you might have to mark the food up a little bit more. And then we want equity in food access, which means that we want people to be able to access food at a reasonable rate. But we also want fair prices for farmers. I mean, you take a local food retail store, and that puts a lot of pressure. Those margins weren't huge to begin with. That puts a lot of pressure in the middle on the actual co-op. So I say, they're asked to fulfill all of our dreams. And I hope that one day they do, but it's a lot of pressure on any business starting up. If you were to look at a privately run business, they would not be asked to fulfill as many of those pressures. The business owner may choose to fulfill one or more of those. But we've had a lot of cooperative placeholders. We've had things that have the word co-op in them that don't function as a co-op, which is, very common. I understand. But one of the main things about being a co-op is that it has to be democratic. So if you have a nonprofit that is running a program, how that program is run and who it benefits is not a democratic process. You aren't building equity. You aren't building in as far as capital equity, as far as monetary equity in the people who participate in those programs, because they're not owning the business. When you're part of a co-op, you're actually building your equity in the co-op, whether it's an electric co-op or a credit union or anyone else or any other thing, then you're benefiting from as that co-op does better. Whereas as a nonprofit, as a user or a recipient of nonprofit technical assistance, you aren't going to, if that nonprofit does better, you don't see a dividend at the end of the year. So or pay for patronage. You're subject to outside funding if you're a nonprofit. That's true for many folks, but that is definitely true in the nonprofit world. And then if you have ad hoc groups, like an informal group, now a lot of times co-ops start, like steering committees start out as an ad hoc group, but if it becomes a perpetual ad hoc group without certain rules to guarantee the democratic process, how they're making decisions, who membership is open to, you can lead to a dilution of purpose, accidentally serving only one set of interests or one set of goals. And sometimes these stop moving forward because there's no definite decision-making process. So they get stalled out. So if you can take some of these, and if they make it to co-op stage, they might be less likely to do that. But there are nonprofits and informal networks right now in Appalachia are carrying a lot of the co-op load. Even trying to start co-ops, which there are instances which co-ops have been incubated in a nonprofit and come on out and stood on their own. But they do amazing things. So I don't want to take away from the fact that these nonprofits aren't doing an amazing thing. Like Kane Community Ag Nutritional Enterprises is one that I'm more familiar with than others. So it's talked about the flooding and all of that. They served thousands of meals from the community kitchen, which is run by a nonprofit. But they've really been pulling the farming and eating community back together. And a lot of the way that you would expect a cooperative to serve its community, they are serving their community. And you look at networks of nonprofits or nonprofits in general, the Foundation for Appalachia, Kentucky had a small grant program, which kind of stood in for and they have done one before, and they had it already set up how to go. They had a small grant program for farmers who were impacted by flooding that stood, so we didn't feel as much pressure to replicate the thing we had done in Western Kentucky for the tornadoes. The nonprofits pulled together to find and distribute produce for farmers to sell at farmers markets because their lands were flooded. And then they organized students to work on small equipment from across the state, like things that, the Kentucky Horticulture Council and a few other organizations got together and literally were like going and getting, all the things that tillers, chainsaws, any small engine repair, and bringing it to students across the state to repair that the farmers had lost. So they're doing a lot of important things, and they're doing it very intentionally. The difference between a co-op and this is that you're serving a population, but that population may not necessarily be getting to decide how they are served and what services they want. So I want to say thank you. And there's certainly, I think, a lot of room for every time. I think I've thought through this presentation twice this morning, and even as I'm giving it now, it's like, there's ways that we could look at cooperative development and think about how we're serving. And of course, my thing is farming and food system, but how we're serving Appalachians in general. Like, my biggest thing and thinking about is we have to have the capacity. And when we say capacity, like Hannah on your slide, it was one of the things where like skills and capacity, one of the first things. And I was like, capacity for what? Like the time, because we do have a lot of people in the region that show up at a lot of the same meetings doing things, and there's only so many projects that each person can take on. And then also you've got to have capacity by the owner members, user owners, however you want to phrase that, and them to feel confident that they can take it on and that it will work. So I enjoy things like this where we can say, like, this can work. Todd has great examples and Hannah does too. With that, I am going to stop sharing and thank you all for your patience. I don't know if they were.
Oh, great. Well, thank you to our panelists there. We'll go ahead and move into the Q&A portion. I know there's been some questions asked and answered in the chat, but would anybody want to put something in the chat or raise their hand and ask our panelists?
Yeah, I did want to point out Robbie in the chat, thank you for sharing that. There are some conversations being convened actually over the next probably over the rest of the summer, I should just say, by USDA, thinking about cooperatives and how they can advance in rural communities in a number of sectors, and thinking about them on a sector-based approach in a virtual format. And that information is in the chat. So thank you, Robbie, for sharing that and keeping those conversations going forward.
Okay, looks like Robin has their hand. If you could unmute there.
Well, I clicked it, nothing happened. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the informative panel discussion. My name is Robin Suggs. I'm with Appalachian Sustainable Development, a nonprofit based in Southwest Virginia, and I'm the procurement manager at the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia. And we're working on facilitating the development of an organization of wild harvesters of non-timber forest products and incorporating a traditionally rural and isolated workforce with a dealer network to help facilitate the sustainable harvesting of non-timber forest products, to ensure that folks throughout the distribution chain are receiving a living wage, or at least moving in that direction, and also respecting the harvester culture and the traditional knowledge base that a lot of dealers and harvesters have in the Central Appalachians. My idea early on was to start a certification program where we could actually validate that these points that I just addressed are being addressed through the types of protocols and processes that harvesters and dealers are being educated on. I guess my bigger question here is, though I'm mildly familiar with worker-owned cooperatives, someone brought up an entity called a multi-stakeholder cooperative. My vision being that is there a way to create a cooperative as an organization where there is one entity, one vote, like all the harvesters, all the dealers, any organization, each entity has one vote in the decision-making process. We've pretty much already settled on a peer-to-peer review process in terms of verification, where all the players, all the entities, all the owners of this cooperative would be involved in peer-to-peer verification to make sure that everyone is doing what they're supposed to do. But is there a way to incorporate NGOs like ourselves and our partners at Virginia Tech to also have a place within the cooperative as a multi-stakeholder cooperative, if such an organization does exist?
Robin, that's a great question. And I'm smiling because there are some excellent cooperative thinkers on this call right now who I've had many conversations about multi-stakeholders with multiple people on this call. So I would welcome some of those folks to jump off and add what they're thinking too. And I would just point out first, Robin, that part of building this regional ecosystem is helping folks understand that there is technical assistance capacity to think through questions like that. So I'm going to plug the folks from USDA who are on the call. They provide assistance in that way, but so do my organization and Myrisa's organization. So working with folks to think through that. You know, one of the things that I have found that is the biggest, maybe not the biggest, I guess I would challenge myself to pull back from the biggest, is that governance in a cooperative is pivotal. It's pivotal and it's difficult, but it's also the thing that makes a cooperative strong and resilient and sustainable in the ways that Todd was reminding us of at the top of the conversation. And so I think that a lot of what at least I have tried to do personally and thinking about cooperative development in the last couple of years is to think very intentionally about governance and to help groups think about governance very intentionally. And that is, I would go back to Myrisa's challenges in the region, is like, that's just not a very familiar model, and it's not a very, it takes time and it takes people. Yeah, Catherine, like simply working in a group is hard. Like, and when you layer business on top of that, it's, I think, one of the biggest challenges to developing a new co-op enterprise. And I can share some multi-stakeholder resources in the chat. There are multi-stakeholder cooperatives examples out there. They're a little difficult because they can create some tensions between the stakeholder groups. One of the things I often challenge folks, I want to hear from some of the other co-op developers on the call. So I hope you guys will unmute and add here. One of the things I challenge folks to think about if they want to think about a multi-stakeholder co-op is why it is important to you to grant ownership over the enterprise to all of these different stakeholders, and if the benefits you're looking for can be brought out in a way that is not based on ownership. So just thinking through that pretty intentionally. So I'm going to stop, put some resources in the chat, and ask my fellow co-op developers on the call to share what they think.
I'll go since no one else is unmuted. But one of the things, Robin, that you were talking about was, it sounds like you want the opportunity for workers to be along the distribution supply chain to be owners, and then the farmers or the harvesters to be owners, and then potentially the NGOs to have a membership role. And one of the things that in some ways, and for me, this really reminds me of, you would almost have, the NGOs to me aren't the users of the co-op, so I wouldn't want to give them more of the vote than necessary in this situation. So like I'm thinking of like limited cooperative associations where in Kentucky, where you could have, and other places where you could have an investor class, but co-op development principles say never give that investor class more than 49% of the voting power total, like all your investors together. And if there's some reason to have the NGOs as members who have representation on the board, to me, the users of the co-op are mostly your harvesters, your workers, even potentially your purchasers. But the NGOs, the hardest thing about a co-op is giving up the power you had when you thought of the idea.
Right. Yeah. Those are great answers, and inform a lot of my response here. Probably what this is going to look like is the NGO nonprofit or / investor class would probably look more like 1% to 2% of the total membership. That's why I'd use the term one entity, one vote. Each non-individual, let's say partner, non-person partner would have collectively one vote as an organization. And then each individual member would also have one vote. So the other participants as individuals would always have much more power at the table, or much more say at the table, than any of the NGOs. I can't imagine it'd be more than 2 NGOs at the table, and probably more like 80 or 90 harvesters, dealers, and other folks that are worker members, if that makes sense. The reason that I feel that the NGO and maybe even the university needs to have a place at the table is to maintain the integrity of the label, because the label will needs some sort of like scientific validation in terms of, how the standards of the label are being applied, who gets to use the label, and how the label is developed. Rather than a top-down approach like certified organic, We hope to be able to, where you have like the US government and then a series of inspectors coming in and telling people, yes, this is allowed practice, or no, this is not allowed practice. And, you're meeting the standard here, you're not meeting the standard there. Everyone at the table, primarily the practitioners, will make up a revolving board, a review committee that actually is self-regulating. So it's a peer-to-peer review process. The actual participants and the owners are the folks that are doing the verification. So actually, it's kind of a unique model in that harvesters can be making sure that dealers are in compliance. Dealers can make sure that other harvesters are in compliance. NGOs can make sure that everyone's in compliance. We're just trying to figure out how this looks so that we can not lose any label integrity in the process.